Welcome to the Australian Water School, the home of demand-driven, industry-designed training for the global water sector.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for another highly informing Australian Water School webinar. It's called Theory versus Practice, the Challenges of Flood Risk Management. My name is Trevor Pillar, and I'll be chairing today. Have a look at that map. Hundreds and hundreds of people joining us from across the world. Thank you, everyone. We're looking forward to working with you on this terrific day to ask questions and comment and listen to the best of the best talk about flood risk management. All right, let's have a look at who'll be talking to us today. Jackie and Carrie and their colleagues. Do come on screen, everyone. Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Jackie. And Anne and Tegan and Bill, their colleagues. Welcome, everyone. So appreciate it. So Carrie and Jackie, you're going to be presenting, and Bill and Anne and Tegan will be ready and raring to answer your questions and comments in the background. Carrie, Jackie, tell us where you're from, Jackie.
So I'm in sunny Sydney, Australia.
Right. Okay. And Carrie?
I'm in Brisbane, Australia, probably sunnier than Sydney.
Right. Yeah. A little bit of competition there. And where are you, Bill?
I'm up in Brisbane, enjoying the sun.
Yeah. Enjoying the sun. And Tegan?
That's right. I'm just behind Carrie. So.
And Anne?
As well in Brisbane.
Oh, well done. Well done. I'm in drizzly, wet, cold, cloudy, foggy, windy Adelaide Hills. Yes, right. But we're going to make it a fantastic day, though. Right over to you then, Carrie.
Thank you, Trevor. All right. So, yes, we're talking about flood risk management today. And I think it's something that we intuitively feel should be quite easy. But once we get stuck into it, we find it's actually much more challenging than we expect. That we have faced lots of decisions and need to make recommendations that are really hard, despite there being some great guidance around. So Jackie and I are going to be talking to this topic today. So the best practice approaches, but also what happens in reality and how to deal with those challenges. So these are some of the topics we're going through. Jackie will be starting, and she'll introduce you to the principles of flood risk management, what constitutes best practice. But then she'll start to bring in some of those sticky points. So what are the barriers to achieving that best practice? I'll take over from there and let you know, when is it okay to compromise, if at all? So we'll come back to those poll questions that Trevor just reported on. And from there, we'll bring in a few other issues. So stakeholder needs are a really important part of flood risk management, and particularly if we want to start compromising. And then finally, I've got a couple of examples to work through so you can start to understand this framework that we've put forward for you, this idea of reconsidering some of the decisions you've made in the past and hopefully use those learnings in the future. And we'll wrap up and then have some time for questions. Thanks, Jackie.
Thanks, Carrie. All right, so before we jump into talking about best practice, I suppose it's good to firstly give a bit of background to define what flood risk management actually is. So basically, it's a process of defining flood risk and then identifying, assessing and implementing measures to mitigate and manage the risk to people, property and infrastructure. It aims to improve community resilience using a broad risk management hierarchy that involves avoidance, so limiting or avoiding risk exposure, minimization, so reducing the consequences of the risk, and also acceptance, so accepting that there's some residual risk and understanding how to manage that. And flood risk management involves a number of key components with different measures that we can adopt. So there's flood mitigation options, which might be structural works. There's land use planning and development controls, emergency management, integrated catchment management, flood intelligence, so flood forecasting and warning systems, and also community awareness, which is really important, making sure the community are aware of their flood risk and what to do before, during and after a flood. So management of the floodplain should be based on best practice, but what does this actually look like? So essentially, when we talk about best practice, we're really referring to a set of underlying principles that need to be considered when undertaking studies and formulating management plans for the effective, strategic and sustainable long-term benefit of the community and the environment within floodplains. So from our experience, there are several key components that we consider contribute to best practice flood risk management. At a high level, this includes the components on the screen. So that is, it should be based on an understanding of the flood risk and the flood mechanism impacting an area. And it should also be based on an approach that is consultative and collaborative, informed and tailored, strategic, multidisciplinary and dynamic. So I'll now go into a little more on each of these components. So firstly, it's important to consider the types of flood mechanisms impacting an area. So what's causing the flooding? Where does the water originate and where is it going? And why does this matter? Well, it influences the rate of onset, the potential for isolation, the flood characteristics, the depth, the velocity. And there's also different flood risk management responses that are required for different mechanisms. So for example, when we consider overland flow flooding, we often call that flash flooding. So there's typically a quicker rate of onset, the flood waters recede quicker, so there's often less warning time and less opportunity for evacuation. Whereas if you've got a town in the downstream area of a catchment and it's affected by riverine flooding, there's often greater flood warning systems available. There's often longer time from the start of the rainfall event to when the flooding will impact that town. So, we need to have an understanding of the flood mechanism and really tailor our responses to our understanding of these mechanisms. And secondly, best practice flood risk management begins with some sort of foundational understanding of the flood risk to people, to property, so that this can be assessed, communicated, and where possible, mitigated. But really, what is flood risk and how do we measure it? So best practice adopts a flood risk-based approach that defines flood risk as a combination of the likelihood of occurrence of an event and also the consequences or impact if that event occurs. So in terms of likelihood, best practice would consider a full range of flood events, from your more frequent events to extremely rare events like the probable maximum flood, and recognizing that there's a range of different consequences and risks that can vary between events of different magnitudes. And we really want to consider the full extent of the floodplain, all the way up to the extent of the probable maximum flood. In terms of consequences, risk requires a risk receptor, so someone or something that's impacted by the hazard. And therefore, it's important to note that there's a difference between flood hazard and flood risk. So you can see on the screen, there's two areas, a more rural environment and a more urban environment. They have the same high flood hazard, but different actual flood risk, because there's different consequences due to land use, due to people, and due to assets in place. So really, best practice recognizes that flood risk to communities is created by this human interaction with the flooding. And it's this risk that will vary with the frequency of exposure to the hazard, the severity of the hazard, and the vulnerability of the community and its supporting infrastructure. So we really need to have an understanding of this interaction in order to inform our decisions on which treatments to use in managing the flood risk. And then in defining flood risk, we need to assess a number of different components that contribute to the risk, not only to define the risk, but also to formulate appropriate management measures. So firstly, we have the hydraulic risk component. So where will the floodwaters go? Who's getting wet? How fast is the water moving, or what's the flow velocity? How deep is the water? What are the flow conveyance characteristics? Is an area in a floodway or a flood storage area? And also, what's the flood hazard? And then secondly, we need to consider the evacuation risk component. So will there be a loss of evacuation access or isolation? So are areas physically surrounded by water? Is there a loss of access and evacuation routes? How quickly will the floodwaters rise? And what's the availability of flood warning infrastructure? Do we have time between the warnings and the flooding reaching a location to evacuate? And if we need to evacuate, how will we go? Will we go on foot or by vehicle? And is it safe to do so? We also have the exposure. So what population or development is in the path of a flood? How many people and properties will be impacted? Will there be failing structures or infrastructure? Will there be a loss of service and amenity, water, power, food supplies, medical assistance? And finally, what's the vulnerability of the community? Is the community resilient and tolerant to flooding, or are there vulnerable land uses or people? So where are vulnerable uses located? Are there hospitals and childcare centres? Are there aged care facilities? So all of these components need to be considered to have a clear picture of the flood risk. And I suppose lastly, there's different types of flood risk. So there's really 3 different types of flood risk that we consider. So firstly, we have the existing flood risk. So this is based on the current conditions, the current catchment, floodplain, climate, development conditions. And knowing the existing flood risk to the community provides the basis for making informed decisions on whether the risk is tolerable, whether to treat the risk, and if so, how do we do it? Secondly, we have the future flood risk. So how will the flood risk change over time? We need to consider the future catchment, climate, development scenarios. And then I suppose knowledge of the future flood risk can feed into strategic land use planning, for example. So we can inform decisions on where and how to develop the floodplain to ensure that the risk to new development and its occupants are acceptable, or where not to develop. So where new development may impact flood behaviour and increase the risk to existing development? Or are there areas where the flood hazard's too high and we just can't manage the risk, so we shouldn't put more people there? And finally, there's the residual risk. So this is the risk that remains once measures are implemented. And so unless you're going to be designing or tailoring your flood risk management plan to the probable maximum flood, then and you're also assuming that works won't fail if you do implement them, then there'll always be a flood risk to the community. And this risk will remain, for that community. And we need to really look at emergency management and recovery planning. And so this can be supported by systems and infrastructure to reduce the residual flood risk. So now we've talked about defining the flood risk and different mechanisms. And then I suppose there's really a number of key components of flood risk management best practice that we really talk about in terms of our approach. So best practice flood risk management should be consultative and collaborative. Where possible, it should be a partnership between the government and the community, using a range of measures to reduce the risk to the community. So decisions on managing the flood risk should be made in consultation with stakeholders in the community that are actually impacted by the floods. And in doing so, this helps flood risk managers to understand the roles and responsibilities of those involved with flood risk management. Also what the flood risk knowledge and response is of the community. So we really should always recognise the value of local knowledge and those with boots on the ground who experience and respond to the floods. And also we need to have an understanding of the community profile. So what's the vulnerability of the community? What do they value? What are their ideas and what are their needs? Best practice flood risk management is also informed and tailored. So we should make informed decisions within the context of the legislative and policy framework and using the best information available at the time that we make the decisions. Best practice flood risk management should be tailored. So it's tailored to the needs of the study area, considering the catchment, the type of flooding, the type of flood risk, the magnitude and extent of the flood risk and the types of development that are present or that may be there in the future, and also the needs of the community. An important component is also that best practice flood risk management is strategic. So we employ a strategic approach rather than a reactive approach. Make informed decisions on development within the floodplain by considering the flood risk as early as possible. And in doing so, we could create risk responsive settlement, land use policy and zoning. And also it's always better to have a plan than no plan. And in terms of prioritising, we should prioritise flood risk management, considering the scale of the existing risk to the community and the scale of the potential growth in risk, for example, new development within the floodplain. We need to have an implementation plan. So what are our timeframes? Who's responsible and where is it going to be funded from? And then we can think about what can be done in the short term and what can be flagged for longer term implementation. In terms of financial costs, think about where there are the biggest gains in terms of economic benefits. And then I suppose at the end, prioritizing what further studies and outputs are needed. So for example, gathering further data in areas of greatest development pressure or future growth areas, or if you want to consider climate change factors in further detail. Best practice flood risk management is multidisciplinary. So we need to consider a range of factors: social, environmental, community acceptance. Are there other constraints about constructability? Are there land constraints? Do we have available land to build these works? And ideally, we involve multidisciplinary teams. So those specialists that have the greatest knowledge in their areas of practice. And finally, best practice flood risk management is dynamic. You know, flood risk management plans are living documents. So it's really a cyclical process that we can adopt to respond to changes in catchment, floodplain and climate conditions, or changes in policies and legislation. If new data becomes available, you know, terrain data, new modelling outputs, we can consider that we can update plans to incorporate these. And also there might be new funding availability that means that implementing some of the measures becomes more feasible. And finally, don't set it and forget it. So, you know, you get to the end of a study or a plan, give yourself a pat on the back. You've written the report and it gets put on a shelf and gathers dust. You know, that's not best practice. Set a program for review and update studies, plans and measures when required or when possible. But I suppose, is what I've presented an idealized view of flood risk management? Can we simply create a best practice checklist and tick all the boxes as we go? Or in reality, are there barriers to achieving this best practice? From our experience, we can be bound by barriers and constraints in the process that are imposed by data availability, cost, practicality, timing, project scope and funding. And that's really where an understanding of the fundamentals or ideals of best practice principles is needed to guide us on the best path possible within the confines of reality. I'll now pass over to Carrie to continue our presentation.
Thanks, Jackie. So Jackie identified some barriers to best practice, but I guess the big question is it essential? Is that something we have to do? So I guess if we're not doing best practice, what's the alternative? Surely we want best practice. We don't want to do worse practice, kind of okay practice, but those barriers are in place. Best practice is really difficult and really expensive. And there actually isn't a finish line. You can always get more data. You can do more consultation. The community will tell you they want to have lots of consultation. You can test lots of options. You might test a levee, but you can test a longer levee, a higher levee, a levee with pumping behind it, a levee option with a raised road option. You can do all kinds of things. You can keep refining your approach. And then, you know, sod's luck, there'll be a flood in the middle of your study. The model will be recalibrated and you'll go over again. So you have to ask yourself, how far do you go? How far can you go on this pursuit of best practice? So what we want you to think about, instead of best practice, we want to think about fit for purpose. What does that mean? And why are you actually doing your flood risk management study? Why are you starting this process? In most cases, in many cases, it'll be for a local authority like a council. And councils actually have a duty of care to the community. And that duty means that they need to develop an understanding of flood risk, and they need to communicate it and manage it to the best of their abilities. It doesn't mean gold standard beyond council's budget. They need to do the best they can, but they can't always do everything. So instead, they need to, and anyone who's involved in the industry, needs to think about developing a risk-based approach. So putting our greatest efforts and our greatest investment in those areas with highest risk. So the level of risk that the community is exposed to, but also thinking about where that will change in the future. If there are some locations that are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change or changing conditions due to development. And you need to think through all these things and decide a fit for purpose approach. Now we're going to come back to this poll question that we asked right at the study. So I hope everyone's had a go at answering that. When is it okay to compromise in the flood risk management process? So we asked never, sometimes, but only if you absolutely have to under duress, or always. And the answers that Trevor gave back, they're pretty evenly split between yes or never and always. So 46 and 40%. So very different answers. Not many people went for sometimes. You're all pretty certain in your answers and then quite split down the middle. So our solution is both. You're actually both right in our view. Our answer is always and never. So I'll explain that a bit further. We feel that you should never compromise on the fundamental flood risk management principles. So those principles that Jackie went through in terms of your approach being informed and tailored, strategic, consultative, dynamic, those are things which you should really hold to your heart and stay true to through the process. But you can always compromise on the process, on the data, the scope, the budget. But there are caveats, and do not proceed on this without listening to the caveats first. Make sure you listen to the rest of the presentation. So if you're going to deviate from this best practice, this gold standard approach, you need to make sure that it's deliberate and informed, that you know what you're doing and you're choosing to make that decision. And that means you start with a good understanding of what good looks like, what is best practice, what is that gold standard, and then understand the constraints you've got, understand your stakeholder needs, any limitations on the study, and then be really clear, both to yourself, why you're making the decision, but also to stakeholders, your clients, the council, to whoever is involved in the study, on why you're choosing to compromise, why you're not achieving gold standard in this case. So be clear in your understanding, and then make sure you communicate it, not just why you're doing it, but what you expect the implications will be, how it will impact your study. And that can be hard to know at the start of a project, but you can make your best guess and you can go back and you can refine it as you get some more information throughout the project. Some of the things though you should consider, what are those implications? If you choose to compromise, if you're using less than perfect data, if you're using a smaller budget than you'd like, if you're rushing a study more than you want to, if your scope isn't as big as you'd like it to be, what are the implications of doing that? Does it mean that there'll be less confidence in your end product, in the process and in the results and recommendations? And how will that affect how the study can be used? Will it meet its required purpose? If you've understood why the study was needed in the first place, you can now come back and say, okay, does our fit for purpose approach deliver an outcome that meets those original identified needs? And here's a big one. Will the stakeholders lose trust? If you do something that's too rushed and people feel it's a shoddy job, they're not going to listen to your recommendations. They won't have faith that you've done the right thing. And finally, I'd urge you to not be too conservative. So this is, I think, something that I got really stuck on early in my career, was being conservative. You don't want any flood risk. So if there's any chance that it might be one way or another, choose the conservative option. If in doubt, be conservative. But if you do that for every single decision, you run this risk of kind of cumulative decisions, more conservative, more conservative, more conservative, and they build up. So instead, it's better to try and make realistic estimates, understand your uncertainty, but aim more towards realistic, knowing ultimately that the way you respond to your assessment can be a little bit more conservative. And remember, of course, that the flood model inputs to the study, that was also full of assumptions. They might have been conservative too. So here's a little schematic. If you add up those conservative decisions, some of the big outcomes are, of course, you end up overstating the risk, possibly by a long way. And from there, you then over-design your mitigation measures. That might be more flood warning infrastructure than you need, or it might be a higher bridge. It could be a very expensive decision to be over-conservative. And once again, stakeholders can lose confidence in the process and the outcomes. They say, that doesn't reflect our reality. This isn't the scale of the risk in our catchment. So be really careful on that issue. Excuse me. And if you are going to compromise, be conscious that there are trade-offs. So you can always buy your way out of compromises. If you have enough money and time, you can get better data, you can increase your scope, you can do all these things, but there are trade-offs. So think about how much does it cost? What's the financial outlay to reduce this compromise? And here's a big one that I think we don't spend enough time thinking about. How will it delay the study? So if you want to go back and refine your data, refine your process, keep getting stuck in consultation loops, that might delay your study over an entire storm season. During that time, we haven't got flood information out to the community. They don't know that they're in a, a flood risk area. People might be buying properties without having good flood information. There might be infrastructure designed without this information. So be aware that when you're delaying to improve, to reduce your compromise, you're delaying the release of information and delaying the start of action. And I think that's a really big thing to keep in mind. Once again, be thinking about how it improves the confidence of the process and the outcomes. And then this one will vary significantly from study to study. Is it a deal breaker? Sometimes this could be political, it could be relevant to the geography of your area, who knows, but you need to figure that out for your study. Is there anything that cannot be compromised in your study that you have to keep in place? So I've talked a lot about reducing confidence in stakeholders. So I do think it's worthwhile spending a bit of time understanding stakeholder needs. And this is really a topic that can be a standalone session. Engagement and consultation is a very big area and something which gets overlooked a bit sometimes in some of these studies. But if you see this little diagram to the right, this is from the National Floodplain Guidance in Australia. It's called Handbook 7. And that the blue vertical column there, it says communicate and consult. And it goes across every single stage of the flood risk management process. So they really emphasize how important it is to do all the way through. And it has lots of benefits. You can understand what the applications are for the study, how it's going to be used, any time and budget limitations, understanding where it fits in terms of a broader scheme of studies. Are there studies that have gone before it that inform it, or will it be used for subsequent studies? You need to know where this sort of fits in the broader roadmap. Why was the study commissioned in the first place? Is there anything sensitive or political in your catchment that you need to be aware of? And how will you consult during the process? How should you consult stakeholders and when? In what capacity? Do they want to simply be informed? Do they want to be actively engaged in the process? Think about all these things up front. And once you have a good understanding, you can use this to help develop this fit for purpose approach that you're going to apply. And then throughout the study, you can continue to go back to the stakeholders to communicate how you've decided to deviate from this gold standard and what it means. And by doing this, by engaging the stakeholders correctly all the way through, treating them as a trusted partner, you build that trust and the stakeholder buy-in, and they're more likely to accept the outcomes and your recommendations. So I've got just a couple of examples here to wrap up. And I think we've gone a little bit faster than we expected, but that just means more time for questions. So to start with, I'm going to use a really simple example that a lot of people who've done a flood risk management study would have been part of, and that's floor level data collection. So floor level data is a really big input to a flood risk management study, and it can be used for two main things. One is a property scale risk assessment. So understanding what the risk is at an individual property site, at house X, what kind of levels and hazards and velocities and risk ratings do they have? But also to inform flood damages assessments. So these are the assessments we make in kind of terms of base case scenario, the existing conditions. And sorry, let's jump forward. But also in developed scenarios, so we can compare and we can say, okay, how much do we expect the flood damages will change if we introduce some scenario that modifies the flood behaviour, or a policy to raise floor levels, something like that. So we need this floor level data of the properties that are in the catchment to inform these types of assessments. And to do this by the gold standard approach means that we go out with a surveyor to every single property in the floodplain. That means the entire probable maximum flood extent. And we collect detailed floor level survey, do a building footprint. We understand the ground level to the nth degree and the floor level. And I can tell you what, I've got quotes for this in the past, and it is super expensive to the point where it's really cost prohibitive, except for the smallest areas. It's great data, very reliable, but very expensive. It's time consuming too, so it can delay a study. So there are options though. You don't have to do that. That's the absolute gold plated. And so I've got a little list here, which is going from more detailed at the top to less detailed below. So you've got that detailed one I just described, but you can also do options where you drive past and you point a little laser at the top step, or you can use Google Street View, or you can use Google Street View and then kind of apply it, instead of doing it house by house, just apply it for suburbs. Or the coarsest approach is simply to just extract the ground level for every property and add some nominal freeboard. So 200 mils or 300 mils above ground level, and just assume that that's the floor level of your property. And typically what we do and what we recommend is actually a mix. So you'd say this is a risk-based approach to data collection. The areas that are in the lowest risk, so furthest out in the floodplain, they're only likely to be flooded very infrequently. That's an area where you can use some lower confidence data, because they're not going to be flooded very often. In terms of your damages assessment, it makes a much smaller contribution to your average annual damages. Where you're introducing measures that you'd like to test, they're unlikely to be way out there at the edge of the floodplain. But conversely, in those areas which are subject to frequent flooding and there's a higher risk, you absolutely want higher confidence data. And this is a smaller area, it's a subset of your floodplain. So hopefully you can afford to spend a bit of money and do a slightly better data collection process there. So by mixing and matching, we get this tailored approach to data collection, and it's informed by a risk-based decision. So I think that's something we've done before, and people may have done the same mix and match approach, but it's just thinking about why you're doing it in terms of confidence and compromise. And when you're considering what to do, think about how that information will be used. Is it for that property scale assessment or damages? So with damages, you can generally handle a bit less confidence in your data because it's being used for a comparison basis. But if you're going to be reporting information back to property owners at that property scale, you definitely want higher confidence data. And similarly, is it just a regional scale study? Are you looking at trends over the entire catchment? Or are you thinking about introducing some infrastructure, some structural mitigation measures that will impact one particular area? In that case, you'd want some higher confidence data in that area that's likely to be impacted. So in terms of those considerations, yes, consider how good your ground levels are, especially that final option. If you're just going to stick a nominal amount of freeboard on top of your ground level, if it's rubbish data to start with, you're just sort of building bad upon bad. So really think about that and what it means for your study. But also this pathway, and this is something to consider for all these options. Is there a pathway for updating it if you need to in the future? So, what you might do, even within the course of one study, is you might start with lower confidence floor level data, and then assess your range of structural mitigation measures that you're thinking about, shortlist some promising measures. And then if there are some measures you'd like to go forwards with, you can improve the floor level data in those areas where you might get impacts. So if it's just a small area behind the levee where you're expecting adverse impacts, go out and collect better floor level data there, and then repeat your damages assessment and your cost benefit assessment. So again, a risk-based approach to data collection. And finally, of course, and I think this holds for pretty much everything, you can do a sensitivity analysis. So compare data. If you've got some good data, try your coarser approach for the same property, see how different they are, get a feel for how much uncertainty you've introduced by compromising. So the next example I've got here is about using low quality data. So this is a Queensland-based example in the state where I'm presenting from. So about 10 years ago, in 2010 and 2011, there was a massive summer of disasters, natural disasters throughout the state. So there were big cyclones, there was rain for months, flooding up and down the state, saturated catchments, flash flood events, all these kinds of things. So you can see there on the map, 98% of the council areas in Queensland were disaster declared. It was atrocious. And suddenly the Queensland government realised that they didn't have, well, not suddenly, I'm sure they're aware, but it became pressing that there weren't detailed studies throughout the state, detailed flood studies. But unfortunately, it happened at a time when there's also a lot of investment required in the recovery space, repairing infrastructure, all those build back costs. And so the Queensland government needed to come up with a way to quickly understand where there might be flood risk throughout the state. So they could use that to then decide where do they need to go in and do more detailed studies. So where is the flood risk in terms of that hazard that Jackie explained, but also where is it intersecting in town areas? Where's the exposure? So this is what you might call a risk-based approach to flood mapping. Do something coarse to start with, and then use it to identify the risk to go in and do some more detailed assessment. So what they produced was this thing called the Queensland Flood Area Outline, the QFAO. And it actually isn't based on any hydrologic or hydraulic modeling at all. It's a GIS desktop exercise using contours, flood records, soil mapping, satellite imagery, those kind of things. You can see an example there on the right, and it's available online if you'd like to have a look at it. And this is a really regional area. I'm showing that image there. There's no way there would otherwise be flood studies in that location. But we know its origins, and we know it's actually low quality data, and the government themselves know that I'm not slurring the Queensland government there at all. It's just a first pass. And the question is, how should it be used? And in fact, should it be used at all? If it's such low quality, should we just ignore it? Is something better than nothing in this case? So there was one council who did introduce, at least one council. It was a large regional council with lots of town areas. They had been terribly impacted in the floods as well, and gone through a process of developing good, solid flood modelling in their town areas. But they had the spaces between the towns, farmlands where farmers were wanting to build things that would impact flooding, like levees, earthen embankments, and farm dams. But there wasn't already a flood model there. And so the approach that council used, and it was an informed approach, they knew that the QFAO was low quality, but they decided to introduce it to their planning scheme and have it as a trigger, so that if you were in that QFAO area between the detailed flood models and you wanted to develop in a way that would impact flooding, it was a trigger to say, okay, you have to go and do a detailed flood investigation of your own. But when they took it out to the community, the landowners expressed some concerns. They felt that it wasn't good enough quality to be sensible, to be useful for anything. And so they went back to council, and council eventually refined their approach. They went back and they commissioned some 1% sort of rapid mapping for the entire region, which ultimately replaced the QFAO. So was it worth it? It's not an easy answer, actually. It's because they might have eroded the trust in the public by going out with this low quality data. But what were their choices? They didn't have any further budget at the time to do detailed modeling between the towns. There was no driver for it. It's a low risk. There might have been hazard out there, but there wasn't a lot of exposure. But also the modeling that ultimately replaced it, the technology for that, the GPU modeling, it wasn't available at the time when they first introduced the QFAO. So they didn't have that option available to them. And I think they did the right thing in terms of going out to the community, listening to their concerns, and being prepared to treat their response as dynamic and updating it when better information was available. But overall, I think it was a really complex situation. And this is what happens with compromises. And it's what happens with flood risk management studies all the time. This is one particular case study, but this type of thing always happens. And if you're involved in flood risk management, you'll be having to make these decisions all the time. So I'm just going to wrap up now after our examples, and just to give you a few recommendations to take away. So as Jackie mentioned, flood risk management is evolving, and studies are always being updated. So don't see things as a static document, set it and forget it. Gold standard is a nice idea, but it's really, really impractical. You can always do more, you can. sometimes you should try for it, and sometimes you need to just keep moving on. Otherwise, things will never get done or implemented. You should think about what your study parameters are. All those points I raised earlier about why you're doing the study, what are the limitations, are there political issues, and so on. Think about that before you begin the study, but continue to assess it throughout. Make sure you start with a really solid understanding of flood risk management principles and best practice. So the principles that Jackie outlined, but best practice in terms of technique and good quality data and scope and things like that. Once you have that understanding, then you can decide how far to deviate from those gold standard approaches. So always keep the principles, the best practice principles ongoing in your study, but the approaches, the data, the scope, the timing, think about how you might need to compromise those to be able to move forward. And the things to think about will be that scale of risk, how many people are in the floodplain and exposed to what level of risk, your project budget, time scope, any constraints in the data, what the project is going to be used for, and what your stakeholders need out of the project. Once you understand that, you can then establish your fit for purpose and risk-based methodology. And a really good place to get ideas for this is looking at other case studies. Go back to conference papers when people present what they did on their studies. It's a really good resource. You know, if this kind of best practice gold standard thing was straightforward, there would be no case studies presented at conferences. Everyone would just stand up and say, hey, I followed the manual, the end. But that really isn't how life goes. So use that resource and think about how you can use other people's approaches in your own study area. And of course, keep those flood risk management principles as the foundation all the way through. Think about this issue with compromising, the implications of it, and the confidence in your outputs. And I think something which we're starting to see more in flood risk management is not just an implementation plan, but a betterment roadmap, recognizing that you couldn't do everything the way you wanted to right now, often because of budget constraints, but you know you want to move towards it in the future. So you say, okay, let's break this into little chunks of work. We can do this right now and it's useful as a standalone piece of work, but we can also see that it's part of a process that if we do these subsequent steps, we'll develop a really good outcome. So think of that in terms of a roadmap of works. And this issue about being overly conservative, keep that in mind. So overall, I think our big push is that you need to be upfront and transparent about what you're doing and the fact that it's fit for purpose, and that you communicate anything you've had to do in terms of limitations or compromises. It's okay to compromise and you'll need to. Just make sure that it's informed and agreed. And that's all. Thank you very much for joining us. I think Jackie and I will take questions in a moment.
What an absolutely fantastic presentation. It just big picture with heaps of complexity, and Carrie, Jackie, absolutely brilliant. Come on screen, Bill, Tegan, and
Jackie.
Jackie, are you there?
Jackie.
Yes, she is. Sorry about that. Yeah, Jackie. And I'm going to hand over to Anne to chair this next piece. Thank you for your questions, everyone. It's a brilliant. Where would you get 5 of the best, flood risk managing professionals in one place at one time? Right here, Australian Water School webinars, and it's free. But look, this hadn't been easily come by, this experience and professionalism. No more words from me. And take us through some of the questions that have been pounding through the Q&A icon while they've been speaking.
Thanks very much, Trevor. And the questions are really wide ranged and stuff, but I thought a really one that got a lot of interest is for Jackie. So here we go. When should we consider strategic retreat versus investment in mitigation? I thought that was a really interesting one. So I'll hand over to you, Jackie.
Thanks, Anne. I suppose in terms of this question, it really depends on a consideration of the type of development in an area, and also the type of flood risk. So in my presentation, I discussed existing risk, future risk, residual risk. So from my perspective, it's really that residual risk that's possibly the most important component in answering that question. So, in the risk hierarchy, we talk about, avoidance, and then we also consider risk to life, risk to property. So it's really, I suppose, when that risk to life from the residual risk becomes intolerable or unacceptable, we really want to ensure the community's safety. So, if the type of development, say residential or vulnerable uses, and your residual risk is just too great, people can't evacuate, people are going to be trapped by, a probable maximum flood, that's really when you would definitely start to consider strategic retreat and moving people away from that high flood risk to more areas of acceptable flood risk. I'm not sure if you have anything to add, Carrie.
Yeah, I do. And, I've got my favorite planner on the line. I saw her there, so she would kill me if I didn't jump in, which is that it should be considered, I think, more and more in strategic planning. So East Coast Australia has had a terrible summer of floods, and there's been a lot of discussion, more than we've ever had before, about retreat in terms of flooding. It's been around in terms of coastal inundation for a while, but in flooding, it's been really around the edges in terms of a few property buybacks here and there. The federal government's recently released a lot of money for property buybacks, but that's just house by house. I think that if good strategic planning is done, then you can understand where there are areas where development should never have occurred in the future, and you could either seek to backzone in areas where there's a very high risk, so that new development can't be put in there, so that density can't increase, and you should be thinking about a transition settlement pattern.
Thank you both. I think that's that covers that question in a lot of detail. Thank you very much. We might move on to the next one. Another one I got, and might be one for Jacquie initially. Cost and benefits to underpin a business case for flood mitigation requires more than just direct damages in most cases. How do we get reliable indications of indirect and intangible impacts?
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, well, I suppose this is the type of question, this topic, something that we struggle with a lot in flood risk management, because there's so much uncertainty in terms of, your intangible costs, your impact on the community, your health impacts, people's suffering, and, mental health impacts of flooding. And, we've seen that a lot. It's the ongoing effects. It's people who can't find accommodation, and people who are stressed, because they're constantly worried that their property will be flooded again. So I know in New South Wales, we have a manual that we, use as best practice guidance when we're doing studies, and it's really, I suppose, when can you overcome the uncertainty and actually quantify what the cost is, and that's really difficult. And there's different approaches that people adopt. Is it better to include something that's uncertain? It kind of talks to Carrie's point. Are you better to include something that might be, low reliability because it's so assumed, or are you better to not include it at all? And, if you're doing a cost benefit, is it, what are the comparative costs? So, if you're comparing apples with apples, I suppose, does it matter? Will it change things a lot? So yeah, where do you draw the line? But I suppose in all areas, you need to look at what your best practice guidance is, and what they recommend you adopt, and how you calculate those damages.
A few extras I'd add on. In terms of indirect, more and more people are starting to collect data after flood events. So historic building back damages. So if you go to councils, what they've had to pay to repair roads, and collect that data, and you could start to develop some factors, which is often how indirect damages are calculated. In terms of intangibles, I think there's more and more evidence that we are grossly underestimating intangible damages, that they're much bigger than we expect, and that because of it, that there are decisions that we've made in the past where we've said the cost benefit analysis doesn't stack up. We're not proceeding with something when actually, if we included the intangible damages, we could see a lot of value. If you would like a particular resource for the Brisbane River Strategic Floodplain Management Plan. It's online. We did engage an economist to do some research here on the intangibles and the uplift factor, and that varies by flood size. So there are some numbers there that you could use yourself if you wanted to apply it in your own study.
Thanks very much, Carrie. That's really good. That's great. I had a quick one. I think that's more for you, Carrie, and but I thought it is still interesting to get back to. And the question would be, is there a risk of inconsistency in approach when using more specific floor level for higher risk areas?
There may be some risk, but I don't think it's probably of big concern. Yes, if you do it in just one particular patch, looking, as I mentioned, for infrastructure, but we're really looking at this for a comparison's sake. So the example I gave, where you're collecting a bit more data after, say, a levy assessment, looking at properties that are impacted by the levy, you're using it to inform a cost-benefit assessment. I think as long as you accurately report and communicate where your data sources are from, identify that in the future there are other areas where you might want to improve the data, I don't think that it will be a big concern to mix and match the data. And it's certainly been done a lot in the past.
Thank you, Carrie. Yep, I think that's really good. Got one more here, which had two more thumbs up on. Thanks for a well-considered presentation on best practice flood risk management. As practitioners know too well, flood risk management plans are developed with a constraint on budget and timeframes, but still need to meet best practice expectation of the community and government policy. On the issue of land use planning, what do you see as a minimum standard of a flood risk management plan so that future risk is contained, including the impacts of climate change? Maybe that one can go to Jacquie initially.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, I suppose that we're seeing climate change impacts, considered more and more. It's obviously an emerging topic. And it has been for a while. So, within flood studies, we consider climate change, we consider sensitivity to climate change. And, I think I know in New South Wales that, councils develop their own land use planning and policy, and different councils have different approaches. So from my experiences, some councils that already include consideration of climate change in their, say, their flood planning levels, whereas others just consider, the sensitivity of the flood risk to climate change when looking at land use planning and policy and looking at new development. So, it's considered, but a lot of councils are still relying on that non-climate change impact flood risk. But I think, it's a hot topic at the moment. And I think more and more as best practice flood risk management progresses, we'll start to see it incorporated within the planning and policy at local government level.
Yep, I agree with all of that. I think that flooding is actually a little bit slow to implement issues around climate change. I think for one reason, it's not like a progressive creep up like you might see in sea level rise to say that flooding occurs more often and with more intensity. Well, great, but flooding is already so sporadic. So it's really hard to talk about climate change in the flooding space sometimes. I think that as practitioners, we should really be trying to do a bit more and thinking about how we are using that information. There is often the case that we kind of do a sensitivity assessment, show the maps and move on. I think we could be doing better in terms of integrating and looking at areas that will be particularly vulnerable based on old design standards and how that will change with future conditions.
Thank you both. I think that's really sums it up really nicely. Just want to say to everyone, thank you for attending, and I really love having these questions coming in and being able to answer them, and it just demonstrates also that attendees are coming from a range of different countries. So I think it's really, really, really good. We might try to get in one more here and go for this one. How the fit for purpose approach could be considered when integrated solutions are emphasized every day. To me, this is the person, to me, resilience and sustainability can be compromised if we focus on the purpose only. I'm interested to hear on your thoughts on this. So I'll repeat, how the fit for purpose approach could be considered when integrated solutions are emphasized every day. Maybe Jackie?
Thanks, Anne. I feel like I'm your favorite to throw to first.
First, we've got a routine going.
I suppose really, yeah, I suppose a lot of our talk was about that fit for purpose approach. So, you know, I suppose first and foremost, you need to be tailoring your approach to the actual project that you're doing, and you know, those things like the needs of the project, the needs of the client, the community, the needs of the catchment. Could be considered when integrated solutions. Yeah, I suppose if you're using those underlying best practice principles, you know, that's where you're trying not to compromise. So really, you know, that community resilience is the overall aim of the best practice principles. So hopefully if you're, you know, trying to apply those within the realm of this fit for purpose approach, you're not losing that focus on resilience and sustainability. And I suppose recognizing, you know, that we can try and be all things to all people, but sometimes that's a bigger challenge perhaps. So I suppose we need to perhaps focus on what we're trying to achieve with that plan, and yeah, not try and be everything to everyone. Carrie, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I'd build on that. I think it's pretty much what you're saying, but it's up to you how you define your study, how you set the boundaries, the parameters, who you include as stakeholders, what you want to achieve for the outcomes. And when you're going down to assessing measures, your multi-criteria assessment, if you have an idea of what good looks like, if one of your measures is improves community resilience, if one of your measures is, one of your criterion is improving community resilience, if you've got criteria set up that it works with other factors, that there's environmental benefits, that there's sustainability benefits. So you can set up those metrics and that framework to support your overall goals.
Let's go back to this one, which has been sitting there since the start. When modeling flood-related overtopping dam failure scenario associated with an extreme rainfall event, for instance, the PMP event, what background flood EP would you recommend and adopting for the catchment downstream of the wall? Maybe that could be something for Carrie, but I thought I'll jump in there a little bit as well. I think it's important to consider two scenarios, one upstream of the dam, one downstream, and obviously needs to be a smaller one, not the PMP, as a smaller event, such as the 1 in 100-year event or something like that.
Yeah, I think the main thing I'd add is that dam scenarios are often strongly controlled in terms of what you have to apply, what you have to model. So definitely refer to your local guidelines and legislation requirements.
Yeah, in Australia, we certainly have strategic guideline on that as well.
Any final comments from anyone? Bill, Tegan, Jackie, Carrie, Anne, all good?
Thank you all for attending. It's great to have you on the other end of the screen.
Yep. Thanks to the Australian Water School.
A great pleasure, and thanks Joel and Sam at the other end of backing this all up. Look online there right now, you can see on-demand courses, webinars and live courses. It's just a flood, wrong word, of opportunities to learn about water, just water. It's fantastic. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and thanks so much to the presenters and to the Australian Water School. See you next time you're online.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe by clicking the link below and click on the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases. For the latest in significant, innovative and critical advances in water science, technology and management, subscribe now. To build your skills, enhance your technical knowledge and learn from leading experts in water, visit theaustralianwaterschool.com.au and discover our online training courses, both live and on demand.